Okay, you're live on YouTube, whenever you want to go.
Bonsoir tout le monde. Good evening, everyone. Voici, c'est un honneur pour nous autres à Montréal et au Québec de recevoir. Le micro fonctionne pas. We start again, Paul? Bonsoir tout le monde. C'est un honneur pour nous autres ici à Montréal, Québec, afin de recevoir pour la première fois un lancement de livre en personne au Canada. Mais ça aussi comprend certaines complications, par exemple la langue. Les gens qui sont ici, qui ne comprennent pas, qui ne sont pas bilingues, ils ont le droit de recevoir traduction simultanée en ailleurs par Antonio August, qui est un interprète professionnel. So this is our first work. It's an honor for us here in Montreal to be the first in-person book launch of Professor Desai's work. But of course, it brings with some complications. Just so people know what we have here in the back of the room. For people who are not bilingual, English and French, we have the honor to have Antonio, a professional translator in the back, translating from English to French or French to English. So as far as live stream is concerned, you will only hear the language that is being spoken. That is, like I am speaking now in English, or je parle maintenant en français. You hear just that, but you have to bear with it if you don't understand French, for example, if you don't understand English. But I'm sure we'll do it properly. And so, je vais commencer. I'm going to start. C'est la tradition ici au Québec. It's a tradition in Quebec. I think one of the reasons is because we have Normand Raymond, who is a songwriter and composer very well known, un auteur, compositeur, interprète. Donc, on commence à notre façon à Québec avec une petite intervention culturelle par notre ami Normand Raymond, vous l'introduire. Il est né à Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu au Québec. Je vais le juste en anglais. Pas plus simple. So this is Normand Raymond. He's a singer, songwriter, and composer, and is a traditional figure in all events, all progressive, or most progressive events in Montreal and elsewhere as well. And he is, so that you know, he is born in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, Quebec. Normand Raymond moved to Montreal in 1989, where he's been part of several Latin American music groups, including the Ensemble acclaimed from 1992 to 2014. In addition to being a singer, songwriter, and composer, he is also a translator. But tonight we're giving a break, no translation. We have other people. He's also a flutist, poet, and one of the founding members of the Buffalo Hat Singers, a First Nation traditional powwow group founded in January 2012. He's strongly influenced by the Chilean and Latin American new song movements, as well as Cuban Nueva Trova. He considers the song as a tool for social change and transformation to help build peace and solidarity between all the peoples of the world. So if anyone thinks that I exaggerated in presenting a short bio, you will see that I was pretty much on the mark when he sings these two songs. So we're inviting him to take the stage and do his thing, his gig. Thank you, Donald.
Good evening, everybody. Bonsoir tout le monde. Merci, Arnold. C'est une présentation. Oh, je sais pas si. Oui. On n'a pas vraiment fait de test de son. Do any sound check. But we'll try. Do the best. Okay. Voice. It's going to come up on the internet. Hi everybody in Zoom. So, merci beaucoup pour cette invitation. Thank you very much for this invitation for the launching of this book of capitalism, well, against capitalism. And well, here's the book.
Okay.
You can buy it. That's why we're here.
It's also free.
It's also free.
PDF is free.
Not,
The PDF is
oh,
free.
PDF is free. So, donc, nous allons commencer avec une chanson de Raymond Lévesque, Quand les hommes vivront d'amour.
Can you sing in English?
The first song will be a song of Raymond Lévesque. It's a song maybe was composed in 1716, maybe. A long time ago, but it's still how do you say that? Actual.
Relevant.
Yeah. More than ever. So, quand les hommes vivront d'amour, when the human will live of love. Il n'y aura plus de misère. Commenceront les beaux jours. Et nous serons ce sera la paix. Les soldats seront dans la grande chaîne de la vie. Avec passion. Oui, avec voyons. La mauvaise partie. Il n'y aura plus de nouvelles. En son innocent. À l'issue. On a été dans la guerre. Chercher la paix, chercher l'amour. Il donne dans la grande chaîne de la vie. D'ailleurs, il faut toujours quelques perdants. Ici-bas, et le prix. Il n'y aura plus de misère. Et commenceront les Merci. The next and the last song is a song composed by Pete Seeger, but it was translated by Victor Jara and arranged also arrangement from Victor Jara. Et la prochaine chanson et la dernière est une chanson qui a été composée par Pete Seeger et c'est une traduction de Victor Jara. Donc, la canción del martillo de Arnold. Oh, I forgot something. Just, okay. A revolutionary artist has to be one within the hundreds of thousands of hands that are working and building history. Un artiste révolutionnaire doit être l'un des centaines, des milliers de mains qui travaillent a construire l'histoire. Un artista revolucionario tiene que ser uno de los cientos de miles de manos que están trabajando y construyendo la historia. Victor Jara. Oh hermano, oh hermana, oh hermano, oh hermana. Valeria la noche por todo el país, alerta el peligro de ver la noche por todo el país, alerta el peligro de la noche por todo el país, alerta el peligro de canción que cantar por todo el país. Yo de ya, oh hermano, oh hermana, y una canción Laisse maintenant avec Arnold.
Yes, and now I have the honor to present the author of this book and also the person who has made a very important and is making a very important contribution to the discussion on international world affairs. Her name is Radhika Desai. She's professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba. She's director of the Geopolitical Economic Research Group at that university in Canada. She is the convener of the International Manifesto Group. Her books include Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, a Geopolitical Economy, the one that we're presenting today, as well as the Slouching Towards Ayodhya, from Congress to Hindutuva in Indian Politics, published the second revised version in 2004, and Intellectuals and Socialism, Social Democrats and the Labor Party, published in 1994, and also a New Statesman and Society Book of the Month. I would just like to add one other point with regards to the work of Professor Desai, and as the International Manifesto Group, which she convenes, has held, I don't know how many webinars in the last couple of years. I mean, we're talking about dozens of webinars on all important issues facing the society. We had, for example, one on the truckers' convoy, also in Latin America, Venezuela, Cuba, West Asia, Iran, South Africa, you name it, political thinking, etc. And so this is a very important task, and this book is part of her overall contribution in order to develop discussion on all the issues facing us today. Radhika.
Thanks very much, Arnold. Can everyone hear? Is this loud enough? Great. Not sure. Hopefully it's loud enough. Yeah, it should be okay. All right. So first of all, let me say thank you very much to everyone who is here. I'm really honored to be at this first Canadian hybrid book launch, and I would like to thank Arnold August for organizing it here in Montreal. Thanks also to Arnold, William, Jenny Lohr, and Claude for taking the time to speak here today and reflecting on what I have to say in the book. To Norma Raymond, who of course gave such a wonderful performance just now, and to the interpreters, the translators, and also to Owen and Sean for helping organize here, to Brendan to helping organize it in Winnipeg, and to Alan and Paul who are behind the scenes organizing the Zoom and the live stream, where also lots of people are watching. So it's really great. And finally, thanks to the Centre Saint-Pierre for hosting it. I'd also like to thank our Ukrainian friends, at least they say they're Ukrainian, they're also very welcome. I think we are speaking here in the name of humanity, in the name of peace, and in the name of socialism, which includes everybody. In my brief time today, thank you very much. You're so glad to have your permission. In my brief time today, I would like to say a few words about how I came to write this book and then run through some of the main arguments. From the start, my perspective on the pandemic was distinctive. The book was occasioned by the onset of the pandemic. And the question I had before me is, sorry, we would like, you're welcome to stay here and listen, but we would like to not have noise. You're very welcome to sit and listen like everybody else, but you would please like to do something about the noise. Okay, thank you so much. So the book was occasioned by the pandemic, and my perspective on the pandemic was very distinctive. The question I had before me was what should have been a public health emergency, albeit a very serious one. Why had it turned out to be such a knockdown crisis of capitalism, leading to financial markets of every type falling like stones? Central banks engaging in the most unprecedented rescue operations of the most unprecedented scale and scope, and economies facing stoppages and blockages like never before. In the middle of March 2020, just after the WHO declared the public health emergency a pandemic, I wrote a column for the Canadian Left magazine, Canadian Dimension, reflecting this preoccupation.
How much longer is it going to be? Because I have another meeting.
You can buy one right now.
I'll come back because I have your wallet.
Okay.
When are you finishing? Sorry to interrupt.
Come on, we're on 9 o'clock.
Okay, maybe I can catch the last
Yes,
part.
fine.
Thank you.
Okay. So I had been developing a critique of capitalism at the world level for several decades. And already then, in mid-March 2020, I could see that the pandemic was telling on capitalism in both senses of the word. That is to say, exposing its weaknesses and dirty secrets, the racism, the misogyny, the inequality, etc., and weakening it further. So in my column, I was building also on the work that I have done on geopolitical economy, in particular my 2013 book, Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire. And it made three arguments. Sorry, can I please not have noise at the back? It's very distracting. I cannot speak. I think we will have to ask you to leave. I'm sorry. I was going to allow you to stay because I wish everybody to hear my views, but I cannot speak if there is disruption. I'm sorry. In most meetings,
This is not the purpose of this meeting.
Exactly.
Ukraine is not a topic. No one.
Est-ce que vous pouvez la voir sortir? Nous, on paye des taxes ici, madame. On a le droit d'être ici. Je n'ai pas dit que vous n'avez pas de taxes. Oui, mais vous nous empêchez d'écouter ce qu'on a. On paye des taxes ici. Vous devez respecter les autres. On vous respecte, vous devez respecter les autres aussi, madame.
Est-ce que les gens sont là?
Est-ce que vous êtes là pour l'événement? Nous, on est là pour l'événement. On n'a pas de on entend
Big guy is, he's trouble.
Quand j'ai volé les livres nostalgiques, mais dans ce sens-là, mon enfant est en train d'écrire. C'est ça. Amenez nos livres et nos affiches anti-guerre faites par les designers qui prennent tous les bords au quotidien.
This game.
C'est l'expression académique pour propager des mensonges du Internet, de désinformation. Quand je fais ça, dites à moi, à la fois ukrainienne, je suis ukrainienne. Je l'ai lu.
Yeah. I told her.
Devancer tous les autres.
And Justin Trudeau.
I was very much. Very much.
Parlez-nous. Nous sommes à ce moment. Non seulement à Moscou, on va ouvrir la discussion. No, it's for you. We've been waiting for what you need. Contre anti-impérialiste, anti-impérialiste, n'essaie pas de le faire.
Qu'ils avaient réussi à saboter une réunion qui devait avoir lieu ici.
Oh, organisme en plus. He broke the
Monster. He's a monster, that guy. C'est violent,
c'est ça les néo-nazis.
encore parti.
Genre, veux-tu par exemple? C'est bon, allez. Qui est le coordinateur? Qui s'occupe de l'événement ici?
Arnold.
On va avoir besoin de quelqu'un. Donc,
OK, après.
OK.
Après.
De ce qui arrive avec l'heure et toute l'information et tout qui seront présents avec le nom, donc de l'infuse avec les photos.
Okay.
Okay.
Après.
Je vous remercie.
Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Okay, folks, I suppose what I'll do is just so that I can get back into my groove of thinking, I will just start again after the thanks, which I think we have finished. So in my brief time today, what I'd like to do is say a few words about how I came to write this book, and then run through some of the main arguments. From the start, my perspective, so this book was occasioned by the pandemic, and my perspective was distinctive. The question I had was not about the origins of the pandemic or the public health measures or anything. My question was why had what should have been a public health emergency, a serious public health emergency, turned into such a knockdown crisis of capitalism, leading to financial markets of every type falling like stones, central banks engaging in the greatest scope and scale of rescue operations that had ever been witnessed, and economies facing stoppages of the most unprecedented sort. So in the middle of March 2020, just after the WHO declared a public health emergency a pandemic, I wrote a column for Canadian Dimension reflecting this preoccupation. The reason I was able to do this is because I had been developing a critique of capitalism at the world level for several decades. And already then, in mid-March 2020, I could see that the pandemic was telling on capitalism in both senses of the term, exposing its weaknesses and dirty secrets, and also weakening it further, in that sense, telling on it in both sense. In my column, I was also building on the work that I had done on what I call geopolitical economy, a new approach to international affairs that I had put forward in my 2013 book, Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire. And that book made three arguments. First of all, it argued that thanks to the contradictions of capitalism, states had always been critically involved in managing capitalist economies. Secondly, as a result of this, on the international plane, relations between what Marx called producing nations, that is to say what we call international relations, were governed by the logic of imperialism, which arose directly out of the contradictions of capitalism, making the major capitalist economies expansionist and imperialist, and the resistance to that imperialism. So this became a sort of dialectic between imperialism and anti-imperialism that Trotsky had once dubbed uneven and combined development. This meant that the historical evolution of the capitalist world could not be adequately understood by notions of globalization, which envisaged merely the spreading of markets and capitalism around the world, nor could it be understood in terms of a succession of hegemonies, UK hegemony followed by US hegemony, etc., etc. Indeed, geopolitical economy argued that there was no such thing as US hegemony. So instead of these ways of understanding, the way to understand the world economy was in terms of the unfolding of the dialectic of imperialism and anti-imperialism, in which in history so far, the latter has prevailed. Anti-imperialism has had the upper hand, leading to ever widening multipolarity, or what, following Hugo Chavez, I also, after having written Geopolitical Economy, I also began calling pluripolarity. That is to say, we have lived through a very long-term, not very fast, but a very long-term decline in the strength of imperialism. The third argument that geopolitical economy made was that as a consequence of this globalization, US hegemony, free trade, all of these, which pose as theories of the world order, are not at all theories, but rather ideologies. And as ideologies, they serve the interests of dominant countries, by trying to portray the world economy as a seamless whole in which national economies and nation states don't matter. And the reason they do that, the purpose in doing this, is precisely to pry open the economies of the rest of the world so that they may serve to help imperialist countries manage their contradictions, the contradictions of their capitalism, by forcing them to be outlets for their excess commodities and excess capital, and also sources of cheap labor and cheap raw materials. So this book was published in 2013, and since then, I would say that in the decades since then, capitalism's decline and the spread of multipolarity has become much clearer. When I wrote this book, hardly anybody talked about multipolarity, but now a lot of people do. So, and of course, at the same time, the decline of the capitalist world has become more manifest, and this is most manifest in the focus of capitalism, coronavirus, and war, namely the countries that have been, that are the most neoliberal and financialized countries of the capitalist world. That is where we see the contradictions in their fullest form. So capitalism, coronavirus, and war, which, by the way, I should say is available free. I have brought some copies here, but I don't necessarily, you don't have to buy it. You only have to buy it if you want a hard copy. The PDF is free. And I brought some copies to sell at a discount, which is still too pricey in my humble opinion, but there's nothing I can do about it. But anyway, so this book has already been downloaded about 10,000 times. And so in this book, I began writing it as merely coronavirus and capitalism. And I was going to talk about the whole question of what the pandemic had done to capitalism. But I was late in submitting the manuscript. And by early 2022, we witnessed the launch of the proxy war against Russia, led by the United States, in which Ukraine is simply the tool. And if our Ukrainian friends had actually stayed and listened without disruption, I would have tried to persuade them that exactly those people who are saying stand up for Ukraine, exactly those people who are saying we are for Ukraine are party to the destruction of that country. Had they not been party to it, had they allowed the Minsk agreements to be implemented, Ukraine would still exist in a way that it never will anymore. I don't think, I'm afraid. Okay, so I therefore when the proxy war started, I essentially realized that it had to do with exactly the same problems of capitalism that I was already discussing in relation to the pandemic. So I felt that I had to roll a narrative of the war, which I had, by the way, been following and talking about all the way through. So I decided to do that, and therefore it became Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War. So what does this book argue? And I'm just going to now take you through step by step the main argument. So first of all, it argues that the current NATO war on Russia is a result of a decaying neoliberal financialized capitalism, complete with its declining imperial system, cadaverously clinging on to its fast ebbing life. And I'd like to discuss, if you want to discuss this, but I'm very serious, capitalism is past its sell-by date. Secondly, the war's counterproductive results, the unraveling of US influence in various parts of the world, the challenge to dollar dominance, etc., all further underline the dwindling options of imperialism, which of course makes imperialism that much more desperate and violent, but that's another matter altogether. Thirdly, as the geopolitical economy approach has long argued, while actually existing socialism was always the leading edge of anti-imperialism, of opposition to the system. Today, more and more countries, no matter the political character of their governments, are no longer willing or able to subordinate themselves to imperialism. Further, the pandemic told on capitalism, like I said, in both senses of the term. It exposed capitalism's dirty secrets, its inequality, its productive decay, its gross racism and misogyny, and exacerbated its already mounting difficulties. What should have been a mere public health crisis turned into a knockdown crisis pervading economy, society, finance, culture, and politics. As the US and the UK, the leading neoliberal financialized capitalism showed, and this is, by the way, the only form capitalism can take if it is to avoid the danger of socialism. So these two countries in particular performed disastrously in the pandemic context. And the socialist countries led by China, by contrast, performed spectacularly well. After 4 decades of determinedly neoliberal policies, which were supposed to revive capitalism, this outcome, that is to say the debility of capitalism, shows that capitalism is past its use-by date. Indeed, it has passed it several decades ago, indeed a century ago, when it entered the monopoly phase, much as Marx anticipated. The monopoly phase, thanks to the dialectic of uneven and combined development, developed most fully in the late 19th century challengers to British world dominance, challengers such as Germany and the United States. And this, by the way, was already noted by analysts of the system at the time, like Hilferding and Bukhari. British dominance had been founded on capitalism's competitive phase. The monopoly phase represented the culmination of capitalism's ability to develop the forces of production brutally and chaotically as it had done. They would now be developed only through planning, whether that planning takes place in the context of giant privately owned corporations or in the context of socialist states. However, capitalism has continued to exist in good part because of the weakness of the left. And there are many dimensions to this weakness, but one that I particularly emphasize is that very early in its history, the Western left squandered its potential role in preventing this outcome, that is to say, the longevity of capitalism, by turning away from Marx and adopting what Bukharin called a policy of theoretical reconciliation with its theoretical antithesis and political antagonist, namely neoclassical economics. This has blinded even the Marxist left, the Western Marxist left, to the reality of imperialism, rendering them incapable of understanding the main dynamic of international relations in the capitalist world, what Marx called the relations of producing nations. As a result, they became directly implicated in the turn towards the guns and butter reformism, that is to say, a pact between reformist leaderships of the working class and their ruling classes, saying, provided you give us a little reforms, we will allow you to engage in imperialism abroad. So this guns and butter agreements became the norm across the advanced industrialized countries. And of course, European social democracy became deeply complicit in the outbreak of the Great War. Within a decade of the publication of the greatest works on the relations of producing nations, and here I'm thinking of the writings of Luxemburg, Lenin, Bukharin, and other such people who analyzed the capitalist system of that time. Within a decade of these classical Marxist works on imperialism, thanks to the policy of theoretical reconciliation, Western Marxism, in an act of intellectual self-mutilation, faithfully disabled its understanding of this aspect of capitalism. With this policy of theoretical reconciliation, Western Marxism, on the one hand, rejected Marx's analysis of capitalism as contradictory value production on the spurious grounds that, number one, this Marx's analysis suffered from a transformation problem, that number two, Marx did not believe capitalism suffered from a chronic demand shortage, which is a crazy. If you read Marx, you don't see anything else. And thirdly, that he was wrong, that in the long run, there was a tendency of the rate of profit to fall. These are just three of the main points that Western Marxists who have been enamored of neoclassical economics have raised against Marxism. On the other hand, Western Marxists lionized capitalism. Now it was, in their view, no longer inherently contradictory, no longer subject to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which Ernest Mandel called the memento mori, or the reminder of death of capitalism. So instead of a Marxist view, they had a Schumpeterian view of capitalism. And this view, that is to say, capitalism that is able to constantly produce prosperity, develop the forces of production, facing no problems and contradictions, etc. And this conception of capitalism weakened Western Marxist ability to understand what actually existing socialisms in the Soviet Union in the past, in China today, and various other countries had achieved by building considerable prosperity without the privilege of imperialism, and indeed in the teeth of the powerful resistance of imperialism. The 30 Years' crisis of 1914 to 45 was therefore a comprehensive crisis of capitalism and the imperial world it had created. Therefore, not only did 1914 constitute the peak of imperialism, but also of capitalism. That is why eminent thinkers like Keynes and Polanyi believed at the close of that crisis that the world would turn towards building some sort of socialism. And the same diagnosis led their opponents, people like Friedrich Hayek, to fear the same outcome and try to forestall it. These hopes and fears were not dispelled by the post-war golden age, because if you think about what happened during that golden age did see communism establish itself all the way from Prague to Pyongyang, subtracting vast swathes of the world from capitalism entirely. In the developing world embarked on national autonomous development that took distinctively socialistic forms. And in the homelands of capitalism itself, there we witnessed the greatest surge in their growth, thanks not to any capitalist dynamism, but entirely because a senile monopoly capitalism was ringed around with socialistic structures, including macroeconomic management for full employment, progressive taxation, substantial state ownership, financial repression, including capital controls, industrial regulation, the recognition and enlargement of workers' rights and strong unions, and not least welfare states. So in that sense, what these people were anticipating was proved true. However, inevitably, having abandoned Marx, Western Marxists misattributed this growth to capitalism's own dynamic, and this was a radical misdiagnosis. Notwithstanding the socialistic constraints which were put on capitalism, the underlying capitalist character of the first world economies landed them in deep crisis by the 1970s. In response, their political leaders chose to roll back rather than deepen the post-war socialistic measures which had been responsible for the growth of the golden age, instead blaming these measures for the crisis. So these leaders therefore concluded that rolling back these socialistic measures was a way to revive capitalism's dynamism, productive dynamism. Capitalism, Coronavirus and War explains why this neoliberal turn failed. Capitalism's inability to generate growth, let alone the sort of broad-based prosperity that was possible in the post-war period, became manifest. Rather than productive dynamism, capitalism could only generate unproductive, predatory, speculative financialization, a deadly combination of rising indebtedness and asset price bubbles that strangulated production, increased inequality, and provoked routine financial crisis. This type of capitalism sported not the advanced financial systems that originally developed in the countries of finance capital that Hilferding talked about. That represents a totally different relationship between finance and production than what we see today in our very, very sick capitalisms. But rather, they have inherited and enhanced the financial system of the UK, which from the 1970s onwards was also imitated by the United States, and which on which the dollar's role as world money rests, and which it produces this type of speculative and predatory type of relationship between the productive economy and finance. The resulting neoliberal financialized capitalism is the only sort of capitalism now possible. It cannot survive without crises, both of the sort that it is prone to, such as the public health crises or climate crises, both of which are internal to capitalism, in addition to the regular financial and economic crisis that it suffers. So this type of crises are endemic, but there are also now crises capitalism foments itself, such as the ongoing war. Because in order to keep going, like fascism, this type of capitalism, which lacks its own stability, can only continue in existence amid the bubbling froth and confusion of ever new crises. Ever since we turned back from the socialistic path of the post-Second World War era, we have been paying the price economically, culturally, politically, and internationally of keeping capitalism alive. This cost today includes a political system which yo-yos between neoliberalism, which includes apparently leftist solutions to the crisis, such as universal basic income or modern monetary theory, and forces them and forces even further to the right, such as Donald Trump, etc., whose rise is in good part a direct result of the left's inability to understand imperialism and therefore understand actually existing socialism. So the struggle against imperialism is hence the most important task if we are going to stop paying this price, because both imperialism keeps capitalism going in its homeland and prevents the urgent transition to socialism, both inside and outside them. So I hope this has given you some idea of the content of the book. There's much else besides, I can't possibly rehearse here, but I look forward to the discussion, particularly of my commentators, and then a broader discussion with everybody in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. I admire how you kept your cool despite the disruption, and also very much appreciate what you said about those who tried to disrupt it. And it goes a long way to show what they're all about and what we are all about. And I think that we have to say that, you know, the Centre Saint-Pierre received an anonymous email to cancel the event. Okay, so they resisted that, and they did not cancel the event. So I still consider this to be a victory. The event is taking place, but despite the disruption, at the same time, I must apologize. Perhaps could have been a bit more forced. You know, try to find out what is going to happen. But it was beyond our control. But I think you handled it very well, and I appreciate that very much. Now, the next speaker is a longtime friend of mine. I don't know, goes back about, several decades. Professor Claude Morin, who got his PhD at the University of Paris. He is a retired professor. He taught in Latin American history at the University of Montreal from 1970 to 2006. He authored or edited 6 books, wrote close to 30 articles and chapters for journals and collective works. Most of his publications deal with colonial Mexico, contemporary Cuba, international relations, and revolutionary politics in the Caribbean basin. He was and is still a regular commentator in Francophone media here in Quebec about events and processes in the area. He has been traveling extensively all over Latin America for more than 50 years. I'll just add one point. One is that he's also was the chairman of the history department for quite a few years. And having known him for a long time, discussing and consulting with him, I consider him to be like a walking encyclopedia about Latin America, especially in terms of the French francophones. So, Claude, it's your name.
Merci. Alors, merci Arnold pour l'invitation à venir m'adresser à vous pour commenter, même brièvement, le livre qui est l'objet de notre rencontre ce soir, Capitalism, Coronavirus and War. C'est un ouvrage d'une universitaire et d'une militante. De l'universitaire, le livre adopte l'appareil scientifique et l'appareil critique qu'on reconnaît dans un ouvrage universitaire, à savoir qu'il cite ses sources, que les travaux dont il s'inspire, en plus de ses propres travaux qui sont nombreux et qui figurent à la fin des chapitres, de chacun des 7 chapitres, je crois, de ce livre. Nous avons aussi oui, d'accord. Une argumentation faisant appel à une documentation à la fois variée et diversifiée et de grande qualité. De la militante, l'ouvrage propose une formidable critique du capitalisme sous ses différentes formes et ses avatars, de l'impérialisme qui est au cœur aussi de la survie du capitalisme, si bien que les lecteurs, quels que soient leurs intérêts, auront beaucoup à apprendre de cet ouvrage. Il faut en outre remercier l'autrice d'avoir offert une version numérique gratuite de cet ouvrage. C'est exceptionnel que dans le milieu universitaire, en Amérique du Nord, on puisse avoir en même temps un ouvrage imprimé qui, lui, est vendu parce qu'il faut bien couvrir des frais de la publication imprimée d'un ouvrage, mais aussi une version numérique en PDF qui nous permet de prendre connaissance de cet ouvrage et de le lire avec le même intérêt que si nous lisions la version imprimée. Dans cet ensemble qui ouvre plusieurs voies et de larges avenues, j'ai isolé deux objections qui peuvent tenir lieu de questions. La première, d'ailleurs on l'a entendu ce soir, c'est de qualifier la Chine de socialiste. J'ai du mal, personnellement, à considérer la Chine comme socialiste, même si je ne la considère pas comme telle capitaliste, autrement que sous l'angle d'un État puissant qui planifie le développement national et qui impose des règles aux capitalistes qu'elle autorise, tout en menant à l'occasion, et c'est le cas depuis quelques années, une campagne contre la corruption qui, malheureusement, a contribué à détruire l'Union soviétique et à réduire la Russie à un État d'un État un peu failli dans les années 1990. Et ce n'est qu'après 2000 qu'on a vu un retour en force de la Russie parce que, pour lui donner au moins ce qui lui revient, Vladimir Poutine a mis au pas les oligarques et les a obligés, tout en menant leurs propres affaires, à aussi laisser une place pour le développement autonome de l'État soviétique, de l'économie soviétique, qu'on voit aujourd'hui les effets dans la capacité à mener cette guerre. C'est pour moi, le socialisme, j'en connais peu de cas, sinon celui de Cuba, qui représente, à mon avis, la situation la plus avancée du socialisme, à la fois au niveau d'un État qui prend le développement en main et qui aussi développe une démocratie représentative, une démocratie de participation, tout en faisant face à d'énormes défis, soit un blocus depuis plus de 60 ans qui n'a fait que se renforcer au cours des 20 dernières années. Alors, c'est dans ce contexte où je vois la Chine que l'exemple cubain vient un peu nuancer l'appellation que l'on peut attribuer à la Chine en la qualifiant de socialiste. La deuxième observation, elle vient de son traitement du coronavirus. Comment les États ont fait face à cette pandémie et elle soutient que les États dits socialistes, voyant des politiques socialistes, s'en sont mieux tirés. Mon observation découle plutôt d'une expérience avec ce qu'ont été les épidémies dans le passé et de me poser la question, pourquoi ne pas tenir compte d'un possible sous-enregistrement de décès liés à la pandémie dans des pays tels que la Chine, tels que le Nicaragua, tels que le Venezuela. En d'autres mots, ces pays affichent une meilleure performance, oui, mais il y a beaucoup d'inconnus. derrière les chiffres que nous obtenons, qu'on avait à l'époque de la pandémie, à savoir le nombre de décès. Pour la Chine, on disait que il y avait beaucoup de morts qui étaient incinérés et le nombre d'incinérations d'urnes dépassait largement le nombre de décès attribués par l'État chinois à la pandémie. Le Nicaragua, c'est le même problème et le Venezuela aussi. Même si l'État vénézuélien a beaucoup fait compte tenu que lui aussi fait face à une énorme, faisait face à des mesures coercitives unilatérales de la part des États-Unis et des pays occidentaux. Le seul pays qui, pour moi, représente une politique telle qu'on devrait la suivre dans un État qui se réclame du socialisme, c'est Cuba qui a reconnu les décès tels qu'ils se produisaient et on ne peut pas lui opposer un sous-enregistrement chronique de ces décès liés à la pandémie. Alors, c'était les deux observations que je voulais faire, qui sont très limitées par rapport à l'ouvrage, mais je vous encourage, si vous ne l'avez pas déjà fait, à lire cet ouvrage. C'est un véritable cours universitaire qui nous renseigne sur l'interprétation de ce qu'ont été les 50 dernières années du capitalisme à l'échelle mondiale, mais c'est aussi une invitation à changer la société et à la changer par les mouvements sociaux, par les citoyens et par le dépassement de ce qu'est la critique qu'elle fait de la gauche. Il est vrai que la gauche a complètement échoué. Même en Amérique latine, la région que je surveille, il y a eu la gauche n'est jamais allée au-delà de ce qu'elle pensait pouvoir faire face à l'énorme opposition que lui font les partis de droite et surtout les États-Unis, l'impérialisme états-unien pour le nommer. Alors, c'est un peu ce que je voulais vous livrer ce soir par rapport à ce beau livre. Merci.
Merci Claude. La prochaine qui va intervenir, c'est notre ami William Gain Reeder. He is the author of the award-winning Being Chinese in Canada, The Struggle for Identity, Redress, and Belonging, published by Douglas and McIntyre in 2019. He was an anti-imperialist political organizer and was also a leading activist in the two-decade movement for redress of the Chinese head tax and exclusion act. He's a member of the Progressive Chinese of Quebec.
Thank you, Arno. Good evening. Just want to start by saying thank you, Radhika, for writing this book. It's not just an important book, but a necessary book to make sense of the fast changing and developing international situation. The title, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, illustrates a very comprehensive work describing the twists and turns in the development of Western capitalism as a dialectical opposite to the international struggles for independence, liberation, and revolution. You also point out that the outlook on the international situation is somewhat bleak with the warlike policies of US imperialism, if it were not for the peaceful examples of socialist countries like China. Being an anti-Trotskyist, I was amused by a quotation from Trotsky in 1938 that the prerequisite of proletarian revolution have become rotten. This quote applies now more than ever. And I want to focus on your excellent polemic against the Western left that seems to be constantly engaging in defensive battles against social progress and anti-imperialism. As a no-leftist myself, I can appreciate your exposure of social democracy's successful integration of neoliberalism to the workers' movement. Here in Quebec, it reminds me of the Parti Québécois government in 1981. The PQ is a self-declared social democratic party, although it was kept out of the Socialist International by the NDP. The PQ went all in on neoliberalism when it attacked government workers, teachers, and nurses to roll back their wages in 1982. So in the eyes of some in the unionized base, the PQ was exposed as a neoliberal party. Throughout the book, you criticize the failed programs of the establishment left parties like the NDP. I want to focus on this aspect because I feel we need to overcome their unrepentant posturing to maintain the capitalist and imperialist system. We need to do this to win over more people to advance progressive struggles domestically and internationally. Despite the success of socialist countries, especially China, in the fight against COVID-19, you wrote that the Western left treats the success of China, Vietnam, Cuba, and others with disdain. China has eliminated poverty for over 800 million people, which is an amazing accomplishment in history. It is helping other developing countries in the third world with building their infrastructure through the Belt and Roadway Initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative. It is on the front lines to safeguard world peace by opposing hegemonic designs of US imperialism in places like Ukraine, Taiwan, and in the expansion of NATO into Asia. And yet, the propagandized Western left sees China as a threat and an enemy. The NDP and other social democratic forces have the organizational base to carry on their work. But as you point out, they leave working people without serious political representation. You also say that a lack of anti-imperialist, socialist, and revolutionary theory and organization have left the progressive forces in the West in shambles. Your book offers a great theoretical and analytical foundation to expose social democracy, but there is also a need for organization and action. My question is, and I guess it's somewhat like what is to be done. My question is, do you think that it is possible to organize a truly progressive left organization to oppose the entrenched neoliberalism in Canada and to fight Canadian and US imperialism around the world? And in practice, how would you go about doing this? Thank you.
Radhika, do you want to respond to that question now or later? Now, later? Okay, that's good. So the next speaker is Denny Laure Sully. She is a community organizer at Place, a support center for sexually exploited women and girls. She has been a member of Solidarité Québec Haiti since it was founded in 2019. She is active in the fight against imperialism, for the sovereignty of Haiti, and for the defense of migrants' rights in Canada. She has worked as a research coordinator in hospitals and as a psychosocial caseworker in a rape crisis center. She has written for several French and English media outlets, most notably The Monitor, Le Journal des Alternatives, and nouveau cahier de socialisme. Very good.
So I'll do this in English.
No.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you very much, Arnold, for giving me the opportunity, for inviting me to be here. And I'm really also very thankful to Professor Radhika Desai for this book. I think it's really an important book, and it's a book that, you know, the subject, coronavirus, capitalism, coronavirus, and war is really the topic that we need to be speaking a lot more about. And I get the feeling that, unfortunately, there's a tendency to, well, lately, if we look at the mainstream media, there hasn't really been a lot of willingness to speak about, you know, the consequences of how the coronavirus was handled in capitalist countries. And there's been like very little information coming out from how other countries that were in the global south or not capitalist treated the pandemic, the coronavirus crisis. So this is really, this is why this book is so important, because of this, this silence that we have from our mainstream media. We need to be able to think, we need to be able to have scholars that will provide us with numbers, with data, but also that will provide us with theoretical, bring us back to political theory, so that we can think about what is actually going on right now. I look around me and I speak to people, a lot of people, whether they're students, whether they're working class, people who have been impacted by all that has gone on in the past 3 years. And there's this great confusion. And we went from one crisis, which was the coronavirus crisis, and entered into another crisis, which was the proxy war that was, you know, waged by the United States against Russia. Of course, if you listen to the media, what you'll hear is that Russia invaded Ukraine. Yes, that's what happened, but there is absolutely no context. Again, there's a lot of silence. There's a lot of, there's no context, no political context to understand what is going on today with that crisis. That is not just about this proxy war with Ukraine, but that is about the risk of nuclear war between two superpowers. So all of humanity is concerned, just like all of humanity was concerned with the pandemic crisis. So these are two very similar crises, and bizarrely, a lot of people are not making the connections that we went from one very big crisis that had an impact on the entire globe to another one that also has an impact on the entire globe. So the question is, how come? Why do we have these crises back to back? And is this a sign of what happens when capitalism is in decline? Is this the sign of what happens when you have the US hegemony that is in decline? Is this the result actually of that decline? So I see that the book really makes those connections that a lot of people seem to refuse to make. So that's why I was very, very happy to see this book coming out. And I found one thing that I found very interesting while I was reading. It was when Professor Desai said that one of the mistakes that a lot of leftists made was thinking that the dynamic period, the dynamic phase of capitalism was due to its own success, when actually what allowed capitalism, capitalist societies to prosper were the socialist measures that were put in place after the Second War. So that was interesting. This is not something that we hear often enough. And I think that we need more analysis to realize how socialist measures in a capitalist society are very instrumental in allowing capitalism to actually work. And when you get rid of those social measures, when you get rid of the healthcare system, for example, when you get rid of the education system, all those social measures, when you start destroying them, which is what we have seen in the past decades, that's when the decline of capitalism accelerates. So that was very, very interesting. And I think that indeed a lot of leftists have not sufficiently taken that into account. And I wonder why. I wonder if to a certain point, a lot of leftists actually believe in capitalism. So I think there's a reflection that we need to do about who really is interested in a socialist society. It seems like a lot of people who say that they are believe in capitalism, at least here in Canada, and I think it's the case definitely in the United States. So one of the questions that I had, I mean, Arnold presented me as a member of Solidarité Québec Haïti, as you know, a member of Solidarité Québec Haïti, coming from a small country who's been a victim of imperialism for decades. I'm looking at this new world that is emerging. And some people talk about a multipolar world. Others talk about pluripolarity. One of my questions is there really a difference, first of all? And the other thing is, in this new world that is multipolar, can we really have hope that small countries like Haiti that have been victimized and that continue to be victims of US hegemony, of imperialists like Canada and France, can we have hope that this new multipolar world will bring about change for smaller countries? I'm worried that what is going on right now is basically we see that, yes, the US hegemony is declining, and that they're unable to fight superpowers like China and Russia, but they can still fight small countries. And I think that's what they will do, since that they are declining and that they can't face a superpower like China or Russia. And also what we have seen through this war that is going on in Ukraine is that the US is still able to have a lot of power by interfering in smaller countries' affairs, or in the case of Taiwan, which is a province of China, they still have a lot of influence in Taiwan. And with the decline that they're facing, they will, I think they will put even more effort into, you know, having that strong influence in Taiwan, in countries in the Caribbean, in Africa. So what is to be expected with this decline? Will we see a turn for the worse for smaller countries? That's basically my question.
Voilà. I'm really looking forward to Radhika's answer to your
Me too.
questions. And so I'm the last one, this, I'll make it very, I won't say anything aside from a specific question. I am also intrigued about the issue of pluripolarity and multipolarity. Radhika mentioned in her talk, and I read in her book, the notion of pluripolarity emerged initially with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. So my question is, since that time, how has pluripolarity developed since its passing, and with the current, specifically the current Maduro government, who has made some very important statements with regards to a pluripolarity that is increasing in the current situation. So what has changed, or what has emerged to provide even more sustenance to your argument today compared to when it was initially envisaged a long time ago with regards to pluripolarity? So we will now ask Radhika to take your time, finish your notes, and come and respond to our questions.
Okay, thanks everyone, and I hope I will answer these in a relatively short order, and then we can go to a broader discussion, in which, of course, the 4 people who've asked these excellent questions are also free to come back with rejoinders, etc. But so I'll just go in the order in which the questions were raised. But let me just say that Claude was very complimentary, and I thank him for all the nice things he said about the book. But I just would like to make one tiny correction, and that is that I have not made this book available free in PDF. There is a foundation called Knowledge Unlatched, which every year it picks us. It's part of the open access movement. There's a movement to move away from these extremely killer prices that, I mean, the publisher of my book is Routledge. It's one of the biggest, big bad corporate publisher. Essentially, they charge the earth for their books. But Knowledge Unlatched has essentially paid them to make the PDF available free. And then they still charge a lot for, I should say that this, if you want a hard copy, it costs $40. I don't necessarily encourage you to get it, but if you want it, that's at a discount. So they gave me a discount to buy it, and I'm giving you the cost. But anyway, so thanks to Knowledge Unlatched, and let's hope that the open access movement goes further. A lot of things are now available open access, and I would say it's also changing the face of publishing, because I would prefer to publish things where where everybody can read my work, rather than in a place where people have to pay a lot of money to read my work. Okay, so down to the serious questions. So first of all, Claude, you asked 2 very serious questions, and I'm going to treat them with the seriousness that they deserve. I don't at all think that what I have to say is going to end the matter between us, but this is just an initial response, and then we can discuss. So the first question you raised is whether China is socialist. And I think, by the way, from what you said, you seem to take a much more sophisticated position than a lot of people take when they ask this question. So you are not necessarily, I mean, you seem to recognize that, for example, there is a certain amount of planning, public ownership. There is also a great degree of control over corporate capitalist classes, because, you know, normally when people say, is China socialist, isn't there, you know, hasn't it just become just another neoliberal society dominated by big corporations? My standard answer is the following. Yes, there are many capitalists in China. Yes, they are very, very powerful. Yes, some of them are even members of the Communist Party. But I say that the difference between China and a country like Canada or the United States or UK or whatever is that in our countries, in Canada or the US, it's the capitalists that hold the reins of state power. In China, it's the party state that holds the reins of state power. And if the party state wants, it can call the capitalists on the carpet. They say, no, you're not going to do this. You know, you want to do break capital controls, or, you know, take too much freedom with certain IPOs. You are not allowed to do that. Because in their judgment, this goes against against the public interest. And naturally, there is a certain merging of the public interest with the need for the party state to preserve the broad legitimacy that I think it has successfully managed to preserve. I think your point was some larger questions about what happened with the Sino-Soviet split. Did China contribute to the defeat of the Soviet Union, etc.? And these are very involved questions. My personal answer is that the Soviet Union ended as a result of contradictions within the Soviet Union itself. That's what I have learned from what reading I've done. That is to say that a sufficiently large section of the Communist Party elite essentially lost faith in the Soviet system, and that in the process of reform that was set in train by Gorbachev, etc., and undoubtedly some reform was necessary, but the abolition of the Soviet system was not necessary. But in this process, in the confusion that ensued, and you know, there's a big controversy about whether Gorbachev was among those who wanted to destroy socialism, or was he trying to preserve socialism? And I don't know. I don't know enough to take a stand either way. Maybe he was trying to destroy socialism. But nevertheless, in the confusion that ensued, this small elite, which was not democratic, it did not represent the interests of did not represent what the people wanted. The Soviet Union did not end because its economy had become a basket case. It did not end because there was a groundswell of opposition from below. It ended because this tiny elite temporarily took power and used the short period of its power to dissolve the Soviet Union. So in early 1991, there was actually a referendum in the Soviet Union as to whether the Soviet citizens wanted the dissolution of the Soviet Union. 80% of the people voted against the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the leaders of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine got together. That means Yeltsin and Kravchuk, and I forget the other one. Anyway, these guys, they signed a document, dissolved the Soviet Union. That was really the decisive moment in the story. And thereafter, I think Russians have been paying the price. And I mean, one can come back to that. So to me, I don't think that China has necessarily a big role to play. And by the way, in the early part of the Sino-Soviet split, I do feel that it was the victim of a certain, shall we say, European bias of the Soviet Union. Because China was extremely insecure. China did not even have a seat in the United Nations through this period. You know, it was an extremely insecure. The United States had used nuclear weapons against Japan, and it was threatening to use, it had threatened to use them against China and Korea as well. And there is no doubt that there was a particular sense that the United States was going to do it against an Asian population, but not against a European population. So all these things were factors. So anyway, I mean, I think that I delight in the fact that the Sino-Soviet split was one of the most destructive things that happened in the West, in the left, the world left. But now in the new circumstances, the new closeness of the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China is certainly the key alliance of our time. And I think it's a key anti-imperialist alliance, exactly. And I think that in the context, the present context, the Russians are also being forced to move in directions away from capitalism, but we can come back to that. But that's just, and I just wanted to say that, you know, the achievement of socialism is not, is not going to be a tidy affair. I don't think it's going to be easy to say when countries have become socialist or not. But what is very clear, and I think this is also part of my answer to William Deal's points, you know, I think we are living at a time when I don't think we have an option. I think that what's going to happen, it's not, you know, how shall we create a vast enough movement that will impose socialism on the capitalists? We're actually going to live in times, we are already living in times when the ability of the capitalist class to even minimally organize the economy in order to provide for what we minimally need is disappearing. I think we're not going to have an option but to create socialism of some kind. And as we start doing it, we're going to have a lot of arguments and a lot of squabbles, and we're going to have to work through them. And all the for example, you said that only Cuba, for you, Cuba is a socialist country, but China is not, etc., etc. And I think, sure, I mean, I'm sure that there are many admirable things about Cuba that are better than China in many ways, etc. But every country has its own history. We can't overcome that. And I think that what we have to focus on is how can we build socialism in wherever we are, with the resources we have, with the understanding we have, etc. And I think this is going to be the top item on the agenda. On the question of coronavirus, I must say, you raise again some good questions, but I'll try and put my cards on the table and then we can discuss further. So basically your point was that you felt that my praise of what the socialist countries had done, and we'll leave Cuba out of this, let's just focus on China, that, that in the case of China, we don't know the true number of deaths. And so, my praise is misplaced, etc. But I personally don't think that's true. I think we do have roughly a good estimate of the numbers of the dead in China and in the West. And I think the contrast does stand. Secondly, I would like to underline that one of the things I do in the book is I actually underline the extent to which the governments of the neoliberal Western countries initially considered the possibility of simply letting the pandemic run riot. Let it do what it wants, let it take whoever it wants. We can't do anything. How can we shut down the economy? It's going to create a lot of problems, etc. And they were only persuaded to desist from this course and at least impose some sort of measures because they were told that not doing anything would be even more disruptive to the economy, namely the capitalist economy. Because if the government is not seen to do anything, then people will take their own measures. People will not show up to work. People will die. People will end up, having to nurse sick people, etc., etc. So something had to be done. So then our governments had essentially not focused on saving lives. They said we have to balance saving lives with saving livelihoods, which is a euphemism for the capitalist economy. And then in this process, they said we are not going to try to minimize absolutely like zero, what is it called? Zero COVID, yeah, or maximum suppression, as sometimes people call it. What we are going to do is we're going to try to flatten the curve. Why flatten the curve? Not in order to save lives, but only to prevent our health systems, which have already been weakened by 4 decades of neoliberalism, from being overwhelmed. There is no question of giving more resources to the health system, apart from some minimal resources, etc. So actually, this was a pretty murderous option. And the fact that our governments, the governments of exceedingly rich countries, have taken this option is a real commentary on what our governments have done. And I think this needs to be brought out. I should say that as I say, I'm not an epidemiologist, but very early on in the process, very early on in the pandemic, I found a group of independent medical experts. They call themselves the Independent SAGE. And I talk about them in the book. SAGE is an official government body which in the UK, which stands for the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, or SAGE. And so these independent group of people said, we are going to call ourselves the Independent SAGE. So they are not SAGE, but they are a different body, autonomous body, not advising the government. And they formed this group because, number one, they were not sure about what the official SAGE was saying and what kind of advice they were giving. And they were not, they were also critical of, what the governments were doing, because sometimes the governments were not even taking the advice of the SAGE. And so every week they would have a discussion of what had happened in the previous week. And to me, this was really the best intelligence I had on what was going on, what was wrong with the measures that were being taken. And so this was to me a lifeline. And I think it helped me to develop my critique of what had happened. The United Kingdom government has just opened an inquiry into what has happened in the pandemic. This is going to take years to complete. But nevertheless, I think that people are going to come forward and give their evidence. Medical experts are going to come forward and give their evidence. And all these things, I think we should pay close attention to them. So for me, the contrast, and finally on China. China, as far as I know, adopted the zero COVID policy. Some say, oh, they couldn't have done otherwise because they didn't have any, they don't have a hospital system. But the fact of the matter is that in a pandemic, prevention is better than cure. Of course, and so they essentially took, I forget the technical name for it, but it's something like non-medical measures. Which is you need to take them in order to prevent the high rates of infection, etc. And the whole idea was that you do a zero COVID policy, you shut everything down, but then you use the time to put in place the measures that you will need when everybody comes back out, because obviously nobody likes a shutdown. Nobody, it's not just that the capitalist economy does not work. I mean, we all go stir crazy in a shutdown. So it's not advisable, but I think that essentially what the Chinese government has done has proved right in the following sense that, when they declared the opening up last fall and then into this year, my heart was in my mouth. I said, are they really calculating correctly? Like, what is going to happen? There will be a spate of infections. And I think in retrospect, what they calculated was correct, which is that they knew that the level of vaccination had reached a certain stage, which allowed them to open up without too many deaths. And I think that is in fact what has happened. And so they did not do it until that point. The West likes to say, oh, they had no choice, there were protests, etc. And of course, the West again made as much as possible. It was another one of those color revolutions. There's always some silly symbol. There are umbrellas here and roses there. And now this was like this blank sheet of paper. You are oppressing us, etc. But in reality, sure, there were protests, but there are protests of all sorts in China all the time. The key point was that the government decided to do what it decided to do for reasons that are already given. It was reasonably sure that this would work, and I think that it has worked. So that's my point about China. And the main point is not ultimately about the numbers, although I do think the numbers form a contrast. But the main point is the different approaches that the two sets of government have taken. And I think that the Chinese said we are going to save lives. And in the process, they managed to save their economy as well. Whereas we said we are going to balance saving lives and livelihoods, and we lost both royally. And I think that was not the thing to do. So I hope that's okay, and I'm going to go to the next point. So William, you raised some interesting points, and I would say first of all that, like I said, when to your question, I have already given my answer. How will we create a left thing? But I think that we are now increasingly living in a time where we are not going to have options. I think. We don't have an economy that's running very well. We will have to create alternatives. And I think that and of course our governments are, the Canadian government really, next to the UK government, really takes the prize in egging on this war as well, as you've seen against China, against Ukraine, etc. So I would say that, I have no sort of $64 million answer to your question. I think we have to do all the things that need to be done in order to organize. And the first thing is we have to make people aware that socialism is not going to come into being in some pristine form. It's going to come into being out of disputes, arguments, and uncertainties where you are not sure what you are doing is correct or wrong, but you have to be willing to correct your course as you go along. There is no prepackaged answer to socialism. It's only going to happen when we try, and we are going to have a lot of debates and so on, but let's start having them. And one of the big issues is precisely, as I say, this lionization of capitalism that we see in Western countries, which basically assumes that, we have to let capitalism develop all the forces of production that it will. That capitalism is not developing the forces of production. What capitalism is doing is increasingly giving corporations the power to do whatever they like, and in the process they claim to give us what they want, but in reality they give us what they have, which are two totally different things. Instead of allowing us to exploit the possibilities of information and communication technology, we get Facebook. What's the point of Facebook? It just poisons us, our minds, our children, and everything. Where you have the, in China, for example, information and communication technology is being used in a much better way. People are using them for payment systems and many other systems. And people are talking about the Chinese surveillance state. Well, we also have its surveillance state, except our surveillance state is under no public scrutiny whatsoever. Facebook, Google, all of these companies cooperate with the Pentagon on a whole bunch of things we know nothing about. We're not allowed to know anything about them. So, this idea that somehow, Chinese are using ICT to create a surveillance state and we are not, this is wrong. And in fact, on the contrary, what's happening now increasingly is that we are creating technologies which are exacerbating problems, exacerbating inequalities of all sorts. And I think we have to move away from there. And I think the only way of creating a decent life is some kind of socialism. And I would say one other thing, by the way, and that is that so the first thing is we must not lionize capitalism. If we stop lionizing capitalism, we'll understand what were the real achievements of the Soviets, the Chinese, the Cubans, and whoever else, whatever your favorite socialism is, I don't mind. But if you have to understand that this has been achieved without having an imperial colonial periphery to exploit, which is what we have done here. And it has been done in the face of imperialist resistance. You put together both of these things. And there is also one final thing, which is that now the return of inflation, in my humble opinion, is a sign that the West is no longer in command of it. The purchase of Western imperialism is slipping. It can no longer control the world. That is why we have inflation, because essentially in one of the key causes of inflation is that we don't have the same access to cheap resources and also to cheap manufactured goods. And that tells me that we will soon discover the extent to which our standard of living has relied on imperialism. And that will also force us, if we wish to have decent transport, decent healthcare, decent education, we are going to have to build it from ground up. The corporations are not going to do it for us. So I don't know whether that's a very satisfactory answer, William, but that's my broad answer to your question. And I should say also that increasingly here in the West, we may have more choices because we have over a couple of centuries of industrial capitalism, amassed sufficient productive capacity here. But even then, over the last couple of decades, we have essentially destroyed productive capacity at home, assuming that we can keep control of productive apparatuses elsewhere. But that ability is declining. And that's going to tell on us as well. And but in peripheral countries, even in Russia, I would say that the present crisis is forcing Putin to go in directions, and I'm not necessarily an admirer of Putin. I don't condemn him in the way that some people do, but I do think he's far more neoliberal than he should have been. That's another question. But even right now, when I was recently in Russia attending a conference, and while I was there, somebody said to me that President Putin is going to start privatizing state assets in order to raise money for the war. And I thought, oh my God, that's going to be like the worst possible thing he can do. But I now see in today's news, for example, that actually that was just a rumor. In reality, what he's done is impose a new tax on the oligarchs. And I think that's the way to go. And already he has had to introduce elements of planning into the system, especially vis-a-vis defense production. So I just wish that he was doing it across the economy. We interviewed Sergei Glaziev, who has been arguing for more of a state interventionist approach for a long time. Reforming the central bank. The central bank in Russia is still too neoliberal. It's allowing a level of capital flight to take place, which should never happen in the context of a war. This is wrong. This is not what what should be happening. But hopefully, the circumstances of the war will finally, as options close, as the neoliberal options close, Russia will be forced in some kind of a way in a socialist direction. And one hopes that the rest of the world will also take notes. I mean, today, the Chinese economy is far more productive and capable of fulfilling real needs rather than artificial needs of people. And I think that if you are, and today we live in a world where even the most dictatorial government has to provide some minimal level of welfare. Okay, I mean, I'll come back to Haiti in a second, because there is, level of interference there is so great that it's a different category. But nevertheless, in many countries, I mean, that's partly why countries around the world have not gone along with the sanctions, because they expect governments to impose a level of punishment on people that is not possible today. Even if the government wanted to do so, it is not politically feasible. So for these reasons, I feel that we are going in a different direction. So, and then for Jenny Lohr's questions, I mean, you really asked the most difficult question, because really, from what I understand, and I do try to read as much as I can about Haiti, I mean, Haiti is a small country. It is a small country in which the level of US, not only US, but Canadian, French, etc., interference has really been massive. I also accept the view that I think it is so massive because the people of Haiti have shown a level of ability to resist, going back to the 1804 revolution, to today, to Aristide and all those things, where I think if Haiti were to be allowed to succeed, it would be a big signal to the rest of the Caribbean and Latin America and so on. So I think that Haiti has been given some of the worst punishment ever. But so bearing that in mind, I would say that for small countries, your broader question was, Haiti is not China or Russia. What do small countries do? And I think that basically the way I look at it, back in 1944-45, Karl Polanyi wrote a very interesting piece. It was part of his anticipation of the world going towards the left. And I think the title was something like Universal Capitalism or Regional Planning. And what a lot of people thought would happen was that there would be sort of, there were already some large countries, the US, China, Russia, India, etc. So those countries, of course, they are large enough to enjoy economies of scale in terms of production, etc. And those countries that are not sufficiently large would ideally create regional groupings of countries that were able to work together for mutual benefit, not for some countries to dominate others, as happens in Europe, for example, where you don't have a very good situation. But nevertheless, that there would be some kind of a regional grouping to permit efficient economies to be created. So in the long run, I would say that such regional groupings are the way to go. And I think there are already moves afoot in Latin America and the Caribbean region to do that, whether it's ALBA or what have you, various initiatives. And I think those are the initiatives that I would support for the smaller, well, especially the Caribbean is, I think, a prime example of a part of the world where you need some kind of a regional federation in order to make the economy work in a way that will create a broad prosperity. And again, I would also like to say one other thing. People always use the standard of living of the West and the per capita income of the West in particular, which is not the same as the standard of living, to say, well, China is still only a fifth of what the United States is. So, it's true. But the fact of the matter is the rest of the world does not have to become as rich as the United States in order to resist imperialism. And you're already seeing that. I think if people have enough, they don't have to have everything. If they have enough, then you will create that resilience. And that's what we need. We need decent lives. We don't need the obscenely consumerist lives that we have in so many Western countries. So, and that's also necessary from an ecological point of view. And then finally, I'll come to the question of pluri and multipolarity. So as I say, I like everybody else, I was using the term multipolarity. And by multipolarity, I just meant that, there are, compared to the earliest days of capitalism, in which you had essentially one pole of production in Northwestern Europe, basically Britain and the rest of the world. Then the United States, Germany, Japan industrialized in the way that I think is the only way that you can industrialize after some countries have industrialized, which is through state-directed, industrial policy-based, planning-based form of industrialization. And so they had already, their industrialization had already made the world multipolar, although this multipolarity led to imperial competition because there still were parts of the world that these countries could hope to colonize, and they did colonize. But today we don't live in the same kind of world. It's not much as the United States would love to, well, it has tried to take Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, Libya, it would love to attack and control Iran, but it can't. It cannot do that. I think that does represent a change, that does represent a limit to the advance of imperialism. But anyway, so multipolarity is only a word that designates the fact that there are now, production is more widely, productive capacity is more widely spread, and productive capacity is the foundation of all other capacities, military capacity, diplomatic capacity, international power, etc., etc. And so to me, that is a good thing. And the more multipolarity there is, it also creates more avenues for countries that are trying to develop because they have more options to, the fact that the Soviet Union existed was, of course, a big boon for many third world countries, because if the Americans didn't want to give them technology or capital, they could go to the Soviet Union, and it did make a difference. And today there is China, and what China is doing around the world is in quantitative and qualitative terms vastly more than what the United States is able to do. Every so often you will read that, the United States offered Southeast Asian countries $500 million. Meanwhile, China is investing billions of dollars in the same country. I mean, there is no comparison. So I think that these things are creating a different world. And I think this different world is going to be good for countries, not least because, quite frankly, if you want to develop, and if you think that just creating a free market economy is going to allow you to develop, you have another thing coming. You're not going to be able to do that. The only way to develop is to have some kind of planned economy, which is already pretty close, which is already creating the conditions for socialism. Yes, you can have authoritarian planned economies. So it is necessary for there to be popular control over the process of planning, etc. And I think that, unless people are particularly masochistic, they are going to try and exert popular control over what happens in their country. So the reason I went for the word pluripolarity, which was suggested to me on a trip to Venezuela, they said Hugo Chavez used to talk about pluripolarity, and I managed to read a couple of things he had written. It's one of my projects to read more of the things, all these main things here. But basically the idea is the following. In Geopolitical Economy, already 10 years ago, I said that, combined development, that is to say anti-imperialist development, can come in two forms. One is capitalist, the other is socialist. Socialist is stronger, it is more resilient, it's more enduring, etc. But nevertheless, you can have, what the idea of pluripolarity conveys to me is that different countries will create different types of economies. And that is already true even of capitalism. Japanese capitalism is not the same as Swedish, and it's not the same as American, and it's not the same as German. Every one of these economies has very, very unique institutions. In one case, banks play a very interesting role. In another case, tripartite bargaining plays a very important role. In yet another case, the Ministry of, International Trade and something, Ministry of International Trade and Industry. Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, every country has something that it gets right, and it's able to develop, etc., etc. And I think that, yeah, I mean, I can go on about it, but I think I've said enough, and I'm happy to open it up and maybe let other people speak. And maybe respond to them.
Any other questions from the audience?
Would you please come to the mic because we'd like people to see, yeah, and yes, go ahead.
D'abord, je vais dire merci pour ce livre qui est là, parce que toujours, quand il y a possibilité d'avoir de l'information, plus d'informations pour éclairer les gens, c'est toujours mieux. Et surtout dans un contexte après la pandémie, donc il y avait beaucoup de confusion, et de confusion voulue aussi parce que l'impérialisme, le capitalisme a toutes les possibilités, à les meilleurs intellectuels, les meilleures universités pour confondre les gens qui luttent en général. Alors, en fait, c'est un commentaire d'abord et ensuite je vais faire. Le commentaire, c'est parce que de nos jours, on constate que les gens de gauche font une certaine confusion. La confusion, c'est que pour eux, c'est parce que tout ce qui est développement, tout ce qui est production, c'est capitaliste. Donc, en faisant ça, c'est-à-dire, on nie la possibilité aux socialistes de développer, parce que l'un des objectifs du socialisme, c'est aussi développer pour distribuer. Alors, dans le cas de la Chine, par exemple, on voit souvent les gens disent que la Chine a fait son développement, c'est le capitalisme qui a fait ça. C'est une erreur. La gauche, en pensant la gauche a cette responsabilité. Ce qui s'est passé de 1949 à aujourd'hui, ce qu'on observe en Chine, on ne peut pas dire que c'est le capitalisme qui a fait. Je suis content que vous ayez dit que l'État aujourd'hui en Chine agit, tandis que c'est les multinationales dans le monde capitaliste qui agissent. Donc la différence est là. Une des questions, j'arrive aux questions maintenant, une des questions que les marxistes, moi je suis un marxiste-léniniste, mais certains camarades marxistes font, c'est qu'ils disent que la Chine, c'est l'impérialiste. Et c'est l'une des questions, par exemple, qu'Anthony a posé, à savoir, un petit pays comme Haïti, est-ce qu'il va pouvoir s'en sortir? Est-ce que c'est pas en pensant que des pays qui font partie de la multipolarité forment encore un bloc impérialiste? Alors, est-ce que la Chine, en donnant, par exemple, en Afrique, un peu partout, en mettant beaucoup d'argent, est-ce que c'est pas de l'impérialisme pour eux? Ils pensent. Mais Lénine dit qu'il faut faire une analyse concrète de la réalité concrète. Est-ce qu'aujourd'hui, on peut ne pas tenir compte de la base capitaliste qui existe pour avancer vers le socialisme? C'est ça ma question.
Good evening. I thought I have so many remarks to make, but I'm trying to make it really short. And I just finished reading the Confessions of an Economic Hitman. So I know some of that economic banking stuff, the World Bank and all that finance nonsense that's made poor nations around the world suffer. So I thought one of the solutions for that is to change the United Nations. We can leave Russia, China, and USA sitting in the Security Council with their vetoes, and the other 192 nations will get together and run the world against them. And because it appears the three of them are imperial pretenders. You say that China is being very nice about their development projects, but in the end, when the government changes, will there be a new dictator that is not so beneficial to the nations and demanding more China's, it ends up being, again, the empires are there to absorb the resources from the external colonies and enrich the center. So I think that's the standard idea of an empire. So they're doing that, the three of them. And because we're going to have this chase for the resources already. The things are becoming rare, like cobalt and other rare earths and things like that, and they're all going to be competing for those resources. So we're going to have endless conflict unless, I think 192 nations, and I would like our ambassador at the UN, Mr. Bob Ray, who seems to be invisible, but he should be, if I was a UN ambassador, I would be pushing, first of all, to end this ridiculous war and be negotiating and also realizing it's the end of imperialism. I really think it is. I don't know. It's just me, but does anybody want to be a colonial? Canadians have learned they don't want to be colonials. Well, we are still that King Charles is our signatory sovereign. So here we are. And anyway, so now so about 192 nations, but there were a few other points. I was very struck by your comments about Haiti. Yeah, I really feel sad about Haiti. I've heard about it for years, and there's so much difficulty in that country. And Canada and USA and France have not helped. They have not solved the problems. In fact, what was that thing about the UN mission bringing cholera to Haiti? So anyway, I'll leave it at that. I thank you so much for having come all the way to Montreal. And I'm sorry we had such a little brouhaha.
Yeah, sure.
Well, I want to thank you and your patience and putting the straight face with what happened. But I have one question. We see Canada going somewhere where possibly we haven't seen yet, where they actually very bluntly responding to the proxy activities of detaining the CFO of Huawei, the Chinese CFO. What's the name?
Oh, Meng Wanzhou.
We've seen taking a very more aggressive, to my view, very more aggressive action in Ukraine, even more before the US. We've seen what's happening now in Haiti, where they've been imposed, Justin Trudeau have been imposed by Joe Biden to take a leadership role in resolving the crisis in Haiti. We've seen what they've done with Ronaldo, with Venezuela and so on. So where is Canada going? What is Canada? Is it the country or is it the state of the United States?
I thought there was another question.
Oh, this has just been so interesting and I can't wait to read that book. Somebody said something about in Canada that the left had been, was an enabler of the right, really. There is no real left, they're just kind of, and you see that with the NDP. I mean, I'm in NDG West Banff District. We recently had a by-election, so I said, okay, I've tried all the left parties. I've tried the Greens, with Israel, they're ridiculous. I've tried the NDP. The NDP is really a big disappointment. So I said, okay, I'll vote communist this time. Guess what? There were 10 candidates. There's no communist candidate. So I voted for the Bloc. They're the closest to an anti-war party that I could find. So I passed it. So and for Haiti, I mean, the answer is simple. It would be simple if the world was just, is restitution. That's what Aristide started in motion, and that's why they put him on a helicopter and flew him out. But basically, France owes Haiti a lot of money. They owe them all that money that they paid for their freedom, which everyone else takes for granted. So on and on, this is very intriguing.
Okay, so I'll try and answer these as well as I can. So first of all, I agree with the first person who asked the question that in our world, development is taken as essentially taken as the result of capitalism. So if China develops, it must be because China became capitalist. And I think this is because, as I say, of the Schumpeterian conception of capitalism. And I point to the Marxist left, not because I have particularly, I mean, on the whole, they are my friends. I will march with them on 99.9% of the demonstrations. We will agree. But what I'm saying by focusing on them is that even they don't get it. I mean, of course, the mainstream is going to say capitalism is the best thing since sliced bread, wonderful, you know, you can't have anything else, etc. But even the Marxist left has ended up with a what I call a Schumpeterian conception of capitalism. Schumpeter, you know, is often called a bourgeois Marx, but I think the operative word there is bourgeois rather than Marx, because he basically had a conception of capitalism where it was just this profoundly wonderful, innovative system. And yeah, every so often it had a crisis, but it had these miraculous self-regenerating abilities, etc. And so as a result, what we've ended up with is the conception of capitalism in which all the wonderful things we have, all the rich countries are rich because they are capitalists. No, they're rich because they are imperialist. Right. People just don't understand this. You know, I was here in the 1980s. I came as a graduate student in 1984. That was just around the time, I just witnessed enough before the effects of structural adjustment on the third world started kicking in. So when I first arrived here, you couldn't buy cotton clothes. Like it was rare to find cotton clothing. You couldn't buy decent coffee. Coffee tasted like diesel. Like, I'm sorry, but it tasted like, I have never tasted diesel, but that's what I thought. And within a couple of years, you couldn't walk for the products, cheap products of the third world that were flooding into Western markets. And what was it a result of? It was a result of the imposition of structural adjustment on third world countries, forcing them to produce or export, restricting consumption at home, reducing even nutrition levels, let alone other forms of welfare of these countries, forcing them to export everything from strawberries to coffee to cotton to silk to every type of natural product was everywhere in the mouths of this part of the world. And we are just Canada. In the US, it was even greater. And then, of course, all the cheap manufacturers kicked in and so on and so forth. And all of this is the basis to imagine tomorrow you had to pay the real cost of what a t-shirt cost. You couldn't get it for $2 or $5 or whatever it costs right now. Your standard of living will start looking very different. And I'm telling you, this process is already in train. And so far, it's not like we've got revolutionary governments in third world capitals. Even without them, this is already beginning. So imagine what will happen if you got something like that, more conscious government. So I would say that development is in the whole discussion, and that's why I hate ideas of globalization, because it's a way of not talking about imperialism. Right. So in the discourse of globalization, we are told there was a first wave of globalization that culminated in 1914, and now we have the second. What are you talking about? What culminated in 1914 was imperialism. Why are we calling it globalization? In what sense was it global? Globalization makes you feel that all the countries are merrily and happily participating and connecting with one another. No, the connections were imposed on these countries. Railway lines were laid down in colonies not to help them develop, but in order to extract things out of them. Food was being extracted out of these countries while famines were going on. This was the nature of that so-called globalization. And the new globalization wasn't much better. So I would say I completely agree with you. And I think that what we have to, and you asked about China, I think that I would like to say that China is not imperialist. I mean, whatever you may criticize what China is doing here and there. I'm sure it's not perfect. But on the whole, I would say for a variety of reasons, and I can list some of the main ones, China's behavior in third world countries is a complete contrast to what the first world has done. First of all, it does not go in there with an ideology of racial supremacy, which these people did. And by the way, the whole ideology of racial supremacy itself is laughable, because they think they are great because they are rich, but they forget that they are rich because they are imperialist, not because of some genius that they have. So anyway, so that's the first thing. Secondly, I think that the history of socialism, again, we may criticize the record of socialism, but it does, particularly in the Soviet Union, China, etc., it did have an anti-imperialist impulse. It's not forgotten. China has itself had to fight imperialism. And finally, So there's that. And then I would say that the very spread of multipolarity, the spread of pluripolarity makes the imposition of imperial power that much more difficult. It's not easy for you to do this. And China is not, the way I look at it, China is trying to create relations of mutual benefit. Now, there is a big proviso here, and this is partly an answer to one of the other questions. If you start, imagine you're a medium-sized country, you say you open your economy up to China. China is going to flood you with cheap goods. It's not intended. China just has a lot of goods it can sell you, right? It's going to deindustrialize your country. So merely partnering with China is not enough. You have to learn from China as well. You have to be able to say, okay, what do we need to do in order for us to maintain a sufficiently broad productive base that we can be good customers of China, we can be prosperous customers of China rather than customers that are in the process of deindustrializing themselves. So I think all countries in the world are going to have to see China both as a partner, but also maybe not a model, but an example. I don't know what to call it, but obviously you can't just take the lessons of China and apply it like jam on butter or jam on bread. You can't do that, but you have to learn in some kind of tactile way to see, how you can apply it to your country, etc. But no country is going to develop without a lot of planning. We have seen that already, even in the history of capitalist countries. So I would say that these countries are going to have to engage in serious planning efforts, take seriously that development doesn't happen just because you set markets free. On the contrary, the moment you set markets free, you're going to suffer from de-development.
But don't we want de-development? Don't we want degrowth?
Well, thank you. I would say that I agree that we need to think of the resource footprint of our development. But I don't call it degrowth. Like imagine tomorrow, instead of acquiring more and more things, we adopt a form of development in which we have, organic farming and I don't know, instead of consuming more and more things, we, make music, write books and make intelligent conversation. Wouldn't that be wonderful rather than just consuming more and more? This will be also development. I may put a higher GDP value on that rather than consuming more and more things. So it's really not a question of degrowth or anything. It's really a question of what we are doing to resources, to the world, to biodiversity, to climate, etc.
There's a great book, Jason Hickel, he's a UK author, it's called Less is More. About all the growth and all his ideas and how we really need growth.
Well, he calls it less is more. I call it sufficiency. I think we have to talk about what is enough. How much is enough? We don't need more and more. What we need is the ability to create decent lives for everyone. And this is within reach. It's not so far from us. So, okay, I hope that answers the first set of questions. Secondly, I agree that, so the second person was saying they're reading Confessions of an Economic Hitman, you need a change in the United Nations, etc. I would only say, and you were particularly asking about Canada, so maybe I'll confine myself to Canada. First of all, so I've already said that I don't think Russia and China are imperialist. Even today, I mean, Russia is a capitalist country, but even if Putin was a really dastardly fellow willing to impose imperialism elsewhere, which I don't think he is, like, look at it. I mean, he waited for 8 years before even moving on Eastern Ukraine. I mean, he didn't want that sort of trouble. And just look at a map of foreign bases of all the major countries. The US has hundreds of times more foreign bases than the next power. But you talked about
geographically, Russia belongs in Europe, and it should just be an open market all through Russia and Europe together. There's no reason, like, why is this anti-Russia thing?
Well, I'll tell you why. because from the beginnings of modern era, the Anglo powers, the Anglo-American powers have dreamed about the destruction of Russia. They think Russia is too big. They want Russia's resources, and they think Russia is better broken up into small bits that are all more easily managed and also pitted against one
Why
another.
does somebody think that they want to manage Russia? Why?
Because of
USA
that's what imperialism is. They control the world. But anyway, you were asking about Canada, and I'll just quickly answer. It is wrong to see Canada as a colony. Canada may have give me a chance, give me half a chance. Canada should be seen as a country that has been very comfortably nestled in a very favorable niche of the imperialist system. It has been always so. I can send you a short paper I did. I'm not a specialist in the area, but I did want to say this, so I read enough to be able to say this. So it benefited. So, for example, in the classic era of imperialism, people talk about the Sterling Standard. What was the secret of the Sterling Standard? The secret of the Sterling Standard was that Britain presided over a vast empire. Some parts of the empire were her settler colonies like Canada, and other parts of her empire were non-settler colonies like Africa, Caribbean, South Asia, right? Britain extracted surpluses from her non-settler colonies and exported them as capital exports, chiefly to Europe and the settler colonies, with just a bit of crumbs going to the rest. This was responsible for the industrialization of Canada, Australia, the United States, and even continental Europe. What was extracted from her non-settler colonies powered industrialization in these countries. These countries are therefore have already benefited from the imperial system, and today I would say, particularly after the election of the Harper government, essentially sanctified the entry of Western capitalists, chiefly extractivist capital, into the Canadian coalition, capitalist coalition. You have a Canadian capitalist class, which is increasingly a kind of an extractivist capitalist class. It wants to invest in Latin America, even in Asia and Africa, and so on. And they have their own imperialist policies, which they will pursue under the umbrella of the United States. But this is the thing, with the American power declining, they will have to either assert it independently. Do they have the capacity to do so? What will they do? I don't know. So only the future will tell. But Canada is part of the imperialist system. We can talk more about it. I'm not saying that, that say my dear friend Kari Polanyi-Levitt, who turned 100 yesterday, was entirely wrong when she wrote her book Silent Surrender, but that also gave rise to another set of, essentially books like hers, Walter Gordon's report, and etc. They gave rise to a development in which the Canadian government fostered the development of more capitalists. But these capitalists turned out to be these extractive Western capitalists, and that's what we got.
When you're speaking about imperialism, you're speaking from the point of view of the UK. It's an imperial force that colonized, and I just want to point out that Canada.
Yeah, you have to actually.
Something recorded if you speak.
Sorry.
Start.
No, I just wanted to bring in the indigenous perspective that we have colonized the land that belonged to someone else. And that issue really has never been addressed in any meaningful way. And if we were going to pay taxes for our property taxes, we should be paying them to the indigenous people of Canada. And this is what I mean when I think we're a colonial. I'm a settler person. We're a colonial entity. We exist on land that isn't even rightfully ours, and we aren't really addressing that.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. And I would also say that there is a connection between Canada's settler imperialism and its imperialism abroad. Because if you think about it, the Canadian capitalist class is an extractivist capitalist class because it relies on, So I'm being shown the watch. So I'm going to wrap up here, but I completely agree with you. I think, and the two forms of imperialism are to me connected.
Can I make one line comment to you, please?
I guess so. I guess we will have to.
My name is Norma Harrison. I'm in Berkeley, California. Hello, this is magnificent, and I especially liked you on the program about the what was that man's name? I'll have to look it back up again. You were helping out on that very good issue about the loss of leftism in, you know, anyway, I advocate the Ukraine has to be made to surrender. There is no protection of any of its program which is against any remnant of the Russian Revolution, which I am still trying to preserve. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I guess, I mean, look, I hope that the Ukraine war ends in a way that works for everyone. But I agree that, I mean, I think the Ukraine, it's not that Ukraine must be made to surrender. I think it's more that the West has to stop keeps arms.
Well, yeah, but that's the point. And
Yeah,
they will
no, I
stop
agree.
then, they will stop
Yeah,
then
I think you would agree with that. Yeah.
killing the people, and they will stop breaking the country.
Okay, so but I just would like to, as Owen is pointing out, we are really out of time here. We've been going on for a while. So I'll just say one final thing. I think that a large part of my book is really trying to understand the problems of the left. So I agree with the person who said that the left is the enabler of the right, because to me, essentially in the 1970s, once we had the big crisis of capitalism, out of the big fights of the 1970s, a new political formation emerged in which right-wing parties, which were until now at least moderately accepting the socialistic measures, they moved very radically to the right. Now, many people thought that in response, the left parties would move equally radically to the left, but that is not what happened. What happened is that the left parties followed the right parties to the right. So the entire political spectrum moved to the right. And essentially, therefore, we no longer have a left party. What we are calling Social Democratic Party represent like Blair, Biden, Clinton, etc. These people are not leftists at all. They are essentially presenting, they have taken over left of center parties, and they are essentially selling neoliberalism through their working class constituency. Naturally, the working class constituency feels betrayed, which is partly why you get the rise of people like Trump and Brexit and so on and so forth. So we are living in an age of tremendous political confusion. And I would say that the key reason is, as I say, the lionization of capitalism. We've got to stop doing that. We've got to understand where the wealth of the rich countries is actually come from. And if we do, we will both understand imperialism and stop lionizing capitalism. And once you do those two things, actually, there is no way but to some form of socialism. Like I say, because I'm a pluripolarist, I think we will all build a socialism which is different. You know, in Canada, you will not build a socialism without taking into account the interests of Indigenous people. Of course, and that will give a certain character to whatever we have that we will call socialism. Meanwhile, other people will have other issues to deal with. So I think with that, I shall stop.
Yeah.
The program with Carlos Corrido.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
The program with Carlos.
Thank Radhika once again. Well, this was a very, very stimulating discussion on the issue of Russia, China, multipolarity, the left. So I would just like to conclude by saying to fully understand and participate in this discussion, yes, buy the book or get it free PDF. Secondly, the IMG, International Manifesto Group, organizes webinars almost like twice a month. And all of these issues, for example, recently on the book launch of two important books on China that deal exactly in a very concise manner on that very controversial issue, is China socialist or not? So just go online to International Manifesto Group and join us in the webinar that we organize on a regular basis to carry on this type of discussion. And thank you very much, Radhika, for your time, and everyone else here and the question, etc. Thank you.
And thank you very much. And please, yes, I think they will end it. Paul and just one. I just. I don't maybe falling. Okay, bye everyone on Zoom. I'm going to have to end this.